Morning. Our scripture this morning is Daniel chapter 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which had appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai. And it called, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end." And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be in the latter day of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken in place, of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise in place of which 4 others arose. 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors had reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Word of the Lord.
Kids are dismissed at this time. Good morning, Lake Taps. Happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day weekend. Happy Canada Day weekend. Right? Pete, wherever Pete is, that's a shout out. You'll get my Canadian accent at some point, or you've already gotten it. But this morning I want to speak to you on what I've titled The Character of God Revealed in Battle. The character of God revealed in battle. I want to begin by just asking a question. I'll set the stage for what we'll look at this morning. Have you ever been in a stressful situation with someone? Maybe a friend, maybe even a spouse, but the nature of that stressful situation, maybe it's severe, maybe it's a car accident or loss of job or a relationship breakdown, but something in that stressful situation reveals to you something about that person that you've never seen before, that you hadn't seen before. Maybe they get angry and they say stuff that you're like, whoa, never heard that before. Has it ever happened to you before? Or they start doing something, they throw something, or they hit something. There's anger that you see something revealed just because you're in that stressful situation that you've never seen before. On a slightly humorous note, my dad, whenever we would have car trouble, we'd be on the highway and way back when I was growing up, he had this Chrysler K car, which is synonymous with a lemon, like a clunker. And it was a miracle that we got out of that car and we got another car. But anyway, in the days of the K car, whenever there was car trouble on the highway, my dad would start praying. And at first I thought, wow, we're just praying in the car. But then there was a trend that I noticed that actually whenever we had car trouble, my dad would start out in these impassioned prayers. There was something that was revealed about my dad in those stressful moments. Crisis tends to reveal something about who we really are. It's been said, crisis does not make a person, crisis reveals who a person really is. Crisis does not make a person. Crisis reveals who a person really is. And I want to suggest to you that actually as we look at Daniel 8, this chapter that was just read for us, there's something of the nature of evil, of life, of history, how it develops, and also the nature of God that is revealed to us through a crisis. Now, crisis, inverted commas, it's a battle, really. It's a ferocious battle. We have the language of animals. We have goat and ram and all these horns, and we're going to get into all the symbolism there. But it's a battle under sort of what I would call a crisis, because there's something about this battle that we see in Daniel 8 that reveals something to us about the nature of God. And what we'll do this morning is we're going to look at the details of the story. And by looking at the details and the makeup of the story, we're going to land in this question of what does Daniel 8 tell us of the nature of God? Because it does. It tells us something profoundly important about who God is, the nature and character of God. What does Daniel 8 tell us about the nature of God? Let's pray. Father, thank you. You are here with us. Your Spirit is here with us. I pray in these moments you'd speak to us. Help us to hear your voice, Lord. In your name, amen. Now, for those of you who missed last week's sermon, we started into Daniel 7. Daniel 7. And there's a marker, so to speak, that happens at Daniel 7 that makes it different from the rest of the book, only in certain ways, particularly the genre of the book. In terms of themes and aspects of the Bible, or aspects of the book, it actually runs throughout the whole book, from Daniel 1 to chapter 12. But there's something that happens in chapter 7, and it's the genre change to apocalyptic literature. And so before we get into anything, I mean, one catch-up point would be, what is apocalyptic literature? Because from chapter 7 to chapter 12, it actually is comprised of I'm going to make that mistake a few times, so get ready for that. But apocalyptic literature, what is apocalyptic literature? Well, in short, it's metaphor-rich narrative. It's metaphor-rich storytelling that gives you a sense of impending doom. It has with it the idea that existence as we know it will end. That's generally almost a shorthand understanding of what apocalyptic literature is. Something that distinguishes Daniel and Revelation, the two books that are most well known for being apocalyptic literature in the Bible, is that they're not only giving us an idea of the end, and they do so certainly through metaphors. It's very rich in pictures and metaphors. But within this understanding of the end, this theology, this making sense of what the end will look like, it also is infused. It has hope built into it. It has restoration, renewal, and joy built into the end. It's not the theology, especially for Christians, our theology of the end is not fatalistic. It's actually full. The end is full of hope, of rescue, of restoration, of renewal, recreation. So that's sort of shorthand. Okay, what is apocalyptic literature? It's this metaphor-rich storytelling that communicates an impending sense of doom. Existence as we know it will end, but insofar as Daniel is concerned today, it's also full of hope, of restoration, and joy. So the task we have when we think of these metaphors is to look at what's the connection between the metaphor that we see, or metaphors plural, to actually what the metaphors mean, because there's an unfortunate mistake sometimes made when we think of metaphors, and insofar as the scriptures are concerned in terms of allegory, where we might mistake allegory for just not being true. It doesn't have as much truth power to it because, well, it's an allegory. It's an allegory. And that is false, because actually when we think of metaphors, even when Jesus used metaphors, we wouldn't dismiss the metaphors he used as, well, he didn't really mean that, or he's just making a joke. For instance, Jesus, as I mentioned last week, Jesus calls Herod a fox. And we don't think Jesus is actually meaning that Herod is furry and hairy and has a pointy tail. It's actually, Jesus is actually using a picture to tell us something of actually the nature and character of Herod, what he's like. He's like a fox. Just like when Jesus says he is the door, he's not saying he's wooden and has a handle to him. No, he's actually saying he is like a door into reality. He is a real door into reality, into salvation, into peace. Saving power is made possible through him. He is actually like a door, a real door, but he's not a physical door. In the same way, when we come to Daniel, we need to actually, the task we have before us is really to make the connections. Not to see allegory as, well, it's not necessarily as true. No, actually it is true. The question is, what are these pictures pointing to? What are the truths to which these metaphors are pointing? That's the million-dollar question. And we'll get into that, because if we're not careful, we can be sort of overwhelmed with out of Daniel 7, all the beasts, and then you move to chapter 8, and you have the ram and the goat and the horns, and I'm like, after a while, I was like, oh my goodness, lions, tigers, and bears. It's just very overwhelming. But if we actually stay on task and think, okay, what are the truths to which the metaphors are pointing? That's going to help us out. So that's the first piece. That's our task when we think of this metaphor, which is slightly daunting. In a way, that's actually why many people just give up on Daniel and Revelation. I don't know what this stuff is. But the task is thinking, okay, what's the connection between metaphor and reality? The timing is also another piece that's important to recapture from last week. Daniel 7 actually predates Daniel 6. And same with actually Daniel 8. It's actually before Daniel 6. So what we notice in Daniel 8 is all of a sudden in chapter 7, it's not telling the story in chronological order anymore. All of a sudden there's a logical order to it. There's a logic to why Daniel is telling us this vision that he has in 8 before Belshazzar's feast that's actually told in chapter 6. So that's an important detail, and we touched on that last week. If you haven't listened to that, I sort of fleshed that out in terms of the logical as opposed to the chronological reason as to why Daniel is telling us this now as opposed to before, when it actually happened. And many of the themes, just last piece before we get into, just one last preliminary point before we get into chapter 8. many of the themes that actually happen in 7 that we looked at last week run throughout the whole book from here on out. The themes are evil is real. And we certainly see that in chapter 8. You see evil just in its most jagged edge forms. Evil is unleashed. Evil is real. But also it tells us there's this battle, these beasts, but actually that picks up on a cosmic battle. It's not just physical battle. And that's why we looked at even Ephesians telling us that actually even for practical day in and day out life, this is not a flesh and blood type of battle we're facing. Actually, it is a spiritual battle. It's a cosmic battle that we are a part of. But also, within that battle, what we found in chapter 7, God is real. The reality of God is just as powerful and just as true as the nature of evil, but actually it's even more powerful than evil. And we see that in the fact that God wins. How does he win? He wins by giving us Jesus. So if you stay with me so far, that is sort of a quick recap of chapter 7. But knowing that is going to help set the stage, because so many of those themes, the nature and reality of evil, the cosmic battle aspect, God is real and God wins by giving us Jesus, that actually runs throughout the rest of Daniel. So, drink your Red Bull, get your coffee, take your vitamins, because we're entering into another part of apocalyptic literature. Daniel 8, here's the setting. The setting is Daniel has this vision, and he's in a city called Susa, now that we would know, a place as modern Iran. And in verse 3, the first thing that he sees in this vision is a ram, a two-horned ram, and it's charging around in every direction. It's a powerful ram. The second animal he sees in this vision is a goat, and the goat has this very peculiar horn, single horn between its eyes, and this goat is powerful, enormously powerful. It ferociously attacks this ram, and it succeeds in knocking off the ram's horns. And by turn of phrase, we see that the goat has great speed. Verse 5, it comes from the west without touching the ground. So this idea is that this goat is powerful, but it's also very fast. And that's going to, when we get to the symbolism of what that goat actually signifies, we're going to be able to make sense of what that means, the speed and the power of this goat. But we also see that the goat's power, as enormous as it is, it also has an end. His power is suddenly cut off. Verse 8, the horn between its eyes is broken, and in its place grow 4 others, spreading out in 4 directions. Now let's just stop there for a moment. It's important to just go back to ground zero, that these horns in this passage symbolize something. It can be a bit overwhelming, but there's horns in this passage, and we're going to find out because it's actually very explicit in the last half. It's not just going to be by me sort of synthesizing what scholarship has to say about this. We actually see explicit detail of what these horns symbolize. The horns are symbolic for kings and kingdoms. So the meaning is going to be revealed. And so we move along out in verse 9. We see out of these 4 horns come a small horn. And this small horn becomes great. Verse 10, it grew so great, even to the host of heaven. So it enters into the conflict. It's almost this military picture, this horn. And remember, this horn symbolizes a certain power. We're going to get into that. So watch this space. It enters into conflict with this heavenly army. But then chapter 11, it gets even more specific in the vision. It gets even more specific. We see that the horn challenges the prince of the host. So what the horn does here is actually there's an all-out assault against God. The Prince of Hosts is God himself. So the question is, what does this attack look like? What might this attack look like? How is he going to attack? How is this horn going to attack God? Well, we see that actually it's in the form of attacking how he will be worshipped. Formal worship of Israel. The formal worship of Israel is attacked. Verse 11, we see, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of the sanctuary was overthrown. So what aspects might this be? Well, it could be, and knowing just from the Hebrew scriptures, we see like their morning and evening sacrifice at the temple. Maybe that was destroyed. Maybe there was persecution there, physical assault on God's people in that way. Maybe he came against, this ruler came against other temple worship rituals. Destruction of the temple, we don't know all the details here, but we do know that this small horn, still identity to be revealed, makes an all-out attack on God. Specifically, in his people's worship. And we'll get to the specificity of all this in a few moments. And then as we read along here, we see that the story seems to get worse. Evil just continues to run its course until we hear two celestial creatures ask each other in verse 13, how long? How long will this happen? Effectively, they're asking, how long will these horrible events happen, take place? How long will they last? In verse 14, he said to me, this one celestial creature says to another, he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So, that is the first half of Daniel 8. It's packed. It's like chock full of action. Daniel's seen the vision, and now he's wanting to make sense of the vision. And he sees someone appear to him like a man. Now that sort of sounds, especially in the English Standard Version, it sounds a bit clunky, like, well, is he a man or is he not a man? Like, what's going on here? The reason why that's a bit clunky is because it's an explanation of an angel. So he appears to be a man, but something that Daniel hasn't seen before. It's Old Testament scholars would call this a divine aid. So yes, he's an angel, but aid in the sense that we're not to imagine this massively winged creature, as we think of often with angels, but actually someone who looks like a man. So that's why the scholar would say a divine aid here. And that is Gabriel. He comes to Daniel, and we hear the voice of God, really. It is the voice of God calling out to Gabriel. He says, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So Gabriel then comes close to Daniel. And Daniel, when Gabriel comes close, he's frightened and he falls to his face. And Gabriel says to him, understand, O son of man. That word now in Daniel 8, it's important to notice that the language this makes Daniel unique. Among other things, we move back to Hebrew. It's Aramaic, and the chapter 7, Daniel 8 is Hebrew, and that term, O son of man, really is actually just generic. It doesn't have theological language like we looked at in chapter 7. It's actually more just like, understand, O man, or human being. Understand, O son, but the language we have in the English is, O son of man, but it's not theological speak. Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. Now, let's just stop there for a moment, because it's worth exploring who Gabriel is. It's important, like, who is the guy who actually is delivering the message here? Because, let's look at a couple things. First of all, this is the first angel, aid, so to speak, divine aid, to be mentioned in the Bible. That's important because it gives an indication of what angels do. But he also appears in the New Testament. And I think we all know, for most of us, we know where he appears in the New Testament. He appears in Luke's gospel. Luke 1, to deliver the news of Jesus. He comes to Zechariah. Luke's gospel, chapter 1, verse 19, he comes to Zechariah, this priest, and he says, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. That good news is a charged statement of euangelion. It's the news of Jesus, of the Messiah, come to rescue and save. But that's just one part. In the same chapter, in verse 26 of Luke's first chapter, he comes to Mary. And as soon as Mary sees him, she is afraid, interestingly so. That's the similar response to what Daniel had when he sees Gabriel. Mary sees Gabriel, she's afraid. So Gabriel, what does he say? He says, do not be afraid, Mary. Verse 30 of chapter 1 of Luke's gospel. Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God, and behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son. You shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Isn't it interesting? That's Gabriel. Now, we need to be careful not to dig too much into this, but it is interesting because it tells us something that just by the nature of who is giving this news to Daniel, it tells us something of what is to come. That actually, yes, evil will exert its power, but redemption will come. Gabriel is giving that news. Yes, evil will happen. Evil will exert its power, but redemption will come. Gabriel says to Daniel that the vision is for the time of the end. Question is, what does that mean? And I'm telling you, I think we all know there has been a massive industry made out of that one turn of phrase. What is to come of the end? Now, this could be a whole spot to talk about Y2K and all the prophecies that were, calculated in the 90s. But that's actually where we can go wrong, because that's where context becomes incredibly important. Historical context, because given the historical context of when this happens, the clear interpretation, really widely believed by most Old Testament scholars, that is, believed by people who actually eat, sleep, and breathe the Old Testament, is that the time of the end here refers to the historical rule of a particular king in the 2nd century BC. Because that's where all the other imagery points to here. So contextually speaking, it makes sense to actually think that actually the time of the end is actually the time of the end of this particular ruler in the 2nd century BC. To be specific, it's speaking of a king named Antiochus. And we're going to get into him in a moment. So that small horn is identified as actually this king called Antiochus, the Seleucid king in Greece, who ruled in 2nd century BC. So Gabriel, we're going to come back to that in a moment because that's an important part. Gabriel continues to interpret all the animal symbolism. Verse 20, the ram, what does this ram signify? The ram is actually the kings of Media and Persia. And that's actually verse 20. Verse 21, the goat is the king of Greece. And this single horn represents its first king, Alexander the Great. Now this is, now we have the vantage point of being able to look back on history and see Alexander, know all the details that the makeup of his power, of his rise to power, and also his fall, actually have striking similarities to what we see here in terms of, if you look back in the vision here, this goat, we notice that the goat is powerful, extremely powerful. He has this rapid, he's fast, and then he also falls suddenly from power. Well, interestingly, Alexander the Great achieved unprecedented success. Just in terms of power, his conquests happened at a rapid-fire pace. That sounds familiar to the symbolism we see in the goat here in this chapter. But also, he built this empire that ranged from Greece to India. I mean, just the vastness was incredible. Yet he died suddenly at the age of 33 in 323 BC. So he rose to power and had massive power. He died suddenly at the age of 33 in 323 BC. So when we come to verse 23, sort of skipping along here, in the vision, it skips over about 2 centuries of history. And the focus now shifts to that particular horn. Now again, Old Testament scholars almost universally agree, which is interesting because, by the way, there is a lot of uncertainty here. Daniel, especially when we get into apocalyptic literature, it's important to just have some reservation in making these claims. Exhibit A, all the calculations of Y2K, and get your water bottles and go to your lake home or your cottage home because the whole thing's going to go down. Yet it doesn't go down. So that it's important to actually just take notice here and say, well, hey, hold on a second. What do these things actually mean? In this case, though, Old Testament scholars actually almost universally believe and agree that this horn is pointing to Antiochus, 2nd century ruler. How do they make that conclusion? Well, it's in large part because we actually have a lot of information about this guy, particularly in the intertestamental writings, something called the Book of Maccabees. So a book that was written in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, a book called the Book of Maccabees, actually has a lot of historical detailing of this man, his rule. So let me get into it a bit. I'm going to try to not get into the weeds, but it's important detail because it actually validates what we're seeing here. From historical record, we know that he fits all the descriptions, specifically in verses 23 to verses 25, that he's the king that the language of Daniel gives us with bold face. He's a king of bold face. And we know that from history, Antiochus, the Seleucid king under Greek power, he established himself as a bold-faced king by his own intrusion, his disruption of temple worship, his attack against the Jews. And he became famous for political manipulation. In verse 24, we hear the language, this horn's power shall be great. And we know from all historical records that actually this king, this ruler, Antiochus, we know that he grew large through military success. To quote, this is pulling from a guy named Tremper Longman, an Old Testament scholar. I've pulled a lot from him on this one. His influence, and I quote, his influence, is Antiochus' influence reached into Egypt as well as also in Persian, Parthian, Armenian, not to speak of his own domination of Palestine. So again, you have this guy who has massive rule and power. And then we get even more details. Verse 25, he shall even rise up against the prince of princes. In other words, he shall even rise up against God himself. The question is, how did Antiochus do this? And we have many details, and some are very gory details of how he attacked God. One was actually, he made a claim himself to be God manifest. He wanted his name to be Epiphanes, which translates God manifest. And he wanted that name imprinted on all the coinage during his rule. Now, generally when people claim to be God, that doesn't end well. That does not have a good ending. And that is just one part of what Antiochus did. But if that weren't bad enough, he encouraged people in the Mediterranean area to worship him as the Canaanite god, Baal. Now it's worth stopping there for a moment, just a quick sidebar here. Because there's so much of Daniel, especially apocalyptic literature, that actually many of us, if we're really honest, it's sort of lost on us. We're disconnected from it. The rams, the goats, horns, okay, well, there's a disconnect. But what's interesting is actually when we zoom in on this guy's rule, a real person, a real ruler in 2nd century BC named Antiochus IV, yes, there was pressure on the Jewish community. Yes, there was persecution. But also one of the tools he used of seduction was he presented an opportunity to compromise. And we might not be able to relate to, say, persecution, physical persecution. We can, it's more, pressure on our faith is more accessible to our imagination. We know what some of that feels like. But compromise is one of the craftiest tools the enemy of our souls uses against us. We know what compromise is, especially as we think for ourselves in our digital world, where we're only one click away, one swipe away from stupidity. So a question to ask here when we think of that idea of compromise is, what might be the areas in your life? What might be the areas in our life together where actually we've compromised? And even in this moment, the Spirit of God might be telling us, come back. Come back. You've compromised. That is an important question. Now, if we flesh that out, some of us might say, I don't know, actually. I don't know any areas of compromise. That is a perfect opportunity to turn that into prayer. A friend of mine years ago gave me good advice. He said, if you ever sense God speaking to you about something, just turn that into prayer. If there's an area of compromise in our lives, that has particularly compromised our faith, our passion, our loyalty to Jesus, it's worth asking the question, what is that area of compromise? And what might the Spirit of God be actually saying to us in this moment of calling us back? So, back to Antiochus IV. Listen to this excerpt from the Maccabees that tells us of his forces attacking Jerusalem. So, this is 2nd century BC. This is found in the book of Maccabees, outlining something of what Antiochus did. Then the king, I quote now, that's Antiochus, wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. In such words he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice town by town. Antiochus attacked the Jewish forms of worship, but more than that, his assault was against God himself. And it's interesting to see how that worked itself out. In this case, that's one part. I mean, there's so many evil ways in which he ruled, but he presented compromise. He also, and compromise for these people came in the form of, don't worry about, you shall have no other gods before me. Don't worry about that. You can just add, just one, just plus one. Just, you can have one God more. The power of seduction. More than his attack, just to be clear, his attack was not just on God's people. His attack was against, as Daniel puts it, the prince of princes. So verse 25, we come near the end of this chapter. Daniel was told that this ruler, Antiochus, he would be broken. From history, we know that his rule did have an end. And the temple was restored to its former function as a center for worship of the one true God. So we have a lot there to look at. There's a lot to tease out there. But coming back to the central question, what does Daniel 8 tell us about the nature of God? I want to suggest three things here. First, God can be trusted. Daniel 8 tells us something about the character and nature of God. One, that God can be trusted. He reveals history and is involved in history. And three, he will end evil and bring restoration. What does it tell us of the nature of God? One, God can be trusted. Two, he reveals history and is involved in history. And three, he will end evil and bring restoration. So, God can be trusted. The story of Daniel 8 is actually a microcosm of Daniel as a whole, the whole book. And Daniel itself is also a microcosm of the greater story of Scripture. And the greater story of Scripture is a narrative. It's almost like a meta-narrative. It's a macro story. It's the big story telling us that God can be trusted. Now, if we're not careful, that can just become a platitude. Actually, that can easily sound just like a platitude. Like, yeah, just trust God. Well, that's easy for someone to say if actually you're not in a situation that's full of problems and crises. Yeah, platitude. That's not going to work. Doesn't work in my life. I don't think you know what's going on in my life right now. Don't think you know the mess. Don't think God understands complexity. Doesn't look like God can be trusted here. What are we to say to that? He can be trusted, in this case, because he reveals history to Daniel, as one part, and he's involved in history. He reveals history to Daniel, and he's also involved in history. That gives Daniel, it would have given people in exile who actually were enduring an inordinate amount of pain, that would have given them some hope. Let's just stop there for a moment. There's a strong argument to be made that Daniel is getting this vision in 6th century BC. Just bear with me for a second. 6th century BC, he gets his vision. In the 300s, Alexander. And then in the 2nd century, you have Antiochus. I might be off a bit. I forgot to put that in my notes. But the general idea is there, he's getting this vision hundreds of years before it actually happens. Now, some scholars would say, well, it's written in the 2nd or 6th century. That, in a way, don't want to get lost in the weeds here. The point is, there is a God who actually reveals history. That is the point. There is a God who reveals history, and also he's involved in history. He's involved in the story in Daniel 8. There is a king who actually ends evil. There's a God who actually has revealed himself to us. Now, let's just slow that down for a moment. Just think about what that means. If we look at the problem of evil, that's like a whole other sermon or sermon series. But if we look at the problem of evil, it's interesting. there are different points when I've been asked the question when it's almost posed as if Christianity is the only one who has to deal with the question. Like, you Christians, you need to figure out, well, how do you reconcile God and evil? Hold on a second. No, it's not a Christian question. That's a human being question. Everyone has to answer that question, irrespective of faith. So whether you believe in one God, plurality of gods, or no God, you still need to have an answer to that question. The question is what best makes sense of the world in which we live. What worldview, what perspective best makes sense of evil in our world? Now, for Christians, one of the questions that comes from that is, how do you know God? How do you know God in all this? Which is interesting because in a way, that's a Christian Jewish question. Eastern faiths aren't really, that's not the major telos, that's not the major question. And even in Islam, that's not the central question. That is a question down the list, but it's not the central question. Because actually, even if you ask that question in other faiths, they will say, well, we know God by practices. There's a set of practices that we have. That's how we know God. And in other religions, they would say it's by the text. It's by our sacred text that we know God. That's where Christianity really shines a light on Jesus. Because actually, it's not what you know in Christianity. It's who you know. God has revealed himself in a form of a person. And there's no other faith that actually tells us that. God has revealed himself to us in history, God in flesh, the image of the invisible God, first century Palestine. And to top it all off, if that weren't enough, he actually gives us his Spirit to live inside us. Now again, we need to slow that down because actually for many of us who've grown up in the church, that just washes over us. But if you think about that, actually that sounds actually almost like Eastern mysticism, that God lives inside you. That when Jesus left, he actually gave us his Spirit. We actually have the presence of God living inside us. The Holy Spirit of Jesus living inside us. We can trust God because he's revealed himself to us. He reveals history and he lives in us. And more than that, we can trust God because he brings an end to evil and he brings restoration. The celestial creatures ask in verse 13, how long would this go on? And this echoes the psalmists who also asked that question, how long? And actually, in Revelation, the martyrs are the ones who ask, how long? In verse 14, we have this answer, 2,300 evenings and mornings. That could be a whole thing too we go into. But I want to suggest to you the importance is not to calculate when. That's where we sort of get into problems. The point is not to calculate when. Jesus actually gave us pretty specific instructions. We don't know the time. But the point is to be prepared for it. Even though it's a bit sarcastic to look back to all the calculations of 1994 and then, Christ is going to return in 1995. Okay, it didn't work in 1994, but I think we got the calculation wrong. And then 1995, that's when Christ will return. Okay, he's not going to return then. He's going to return at the beginning of the millennium. That's when he's going to return. And then, it's just silly because actually you're working on the calculation. And the point is not to calculate when, it's to actually just be ready. That's the point. Why? Because evil will end. Because actually there is a king who will end this. And not only that, he's not end evil full stop in the sense of, okay, we're just going to finish it, we're going to torch the place. No, he actually restores. That tells us something of the nature of God's justice. The temple was restored. In verse 14, the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. And to be very clear, the temple was a place. It symbolized God's presence and the worship of God. It was a source of life and hope. So the restoration of God's temple means that intimacy, intense worship, intense fellowship with God is possible. So hope was restored because the temple was restored. In a way, what we see there is also a picture of what we see in Revelation, that actually God, in his judgment, is not going to just torch the show. He's not going to just torch the place. He's going to recreate. He's going to renew it. He's going to restore. That's interesting. Because often when we think, even in our day, in our cultural moment, when we think of justice, we just think, well, the thing needs to be burned down. We need to cancel that thing. We need to stop that thing. I'm not going to subscribe anymore there. That's sort of a form of justice, big scale in our cultural moment. But actually God's justice, what we see from beginning to end is actually, yeah, there is justice. There is judgment for the wrong. The wrong will be made right, but there's also restoration. God actually rebuilds, he restores, he recreates. We trust in a restorative God. That, if we think about that, can be extremely powerful. Just think of your life right now. You think of the situation you might be in that actually is like untouchable. Like this thing is a mess. It's not going to be able to be redeemed. God says, yeah, it can. Yes, it can. God says, actually, I can get in that spot. I can restore you. I can redeem that moment. I can restore that relationship. Because God's justice is, by nature, restorative. He rebuilt his temple. If we can somehow imagine ourselves listening to this story given by Daniel, people in exile who were absolutely crushed, loss of national identity, that's like out. Barely hope. Hope is barely in our vocabulary still. And Daniel is saying the temple's going to be restored. That would have given them something to hope in. The temple's restored. How can we trust in this God? We can trust in him because he reveals history. He's involved in history. He puts an end to evil, and he brings restoration. He's a restorative God. Let me just close it with a story here. A few weeks ago, I had our kids for a few hours, wanted to give Brittany a break, so I took the kids, and we went to this restaurant bakery that we really like. I went to this restaurant bakery, and I said, okay, we can get a couple cookies, and we'll all share these cookies. So we go in and get the cookies from the bakery, and the bakery restaurant is busy when we're there. And it's a bit frazzling because a lot of people are there, and I got to just make sure, okay, get the pastries, make sure get all the kids, and okay, then we get out. And we're out on the sidewalk, probably like 30 seconds from the entrance when I get the bag and my phone, got my keys, and I look around like, okay, Sam, Saskia, Curtis, Sabrina. No, Sabrina. Where's Sabrina? And I couldn't find Sabrina. Sabrina was not there. So Sabrina is our littlest. That's a problem. That's a big problem. So I look back to the front entrance, and I go immediately back to the front entrance. And as soon as I go back to the front entrance there, I see her with two of the waitresses there, and they're saying, don't worry about it. This kind of thing always happens, and I feel like very, very bad. It's like really bad dad moment. So I get her, and I say, oh, honey, I love you, I love you, I love you. And she said, you left me. And I said, no, I did not leave you. I came back for you. I didn't forget you. I came back for you. And I was repeating over and over, I love you, honey. I came back for you. I didn't forget you. And so I pick her up, I hold her, and then we just walk. And then we get into the van, and the cookies covered a multitude of sins in that moment. And fast forward a few weeks. And Brittany told me this just a couple days ago. They were driving around that area, and they were driving around that restaurant bakery. And Curtis yelled out, hey, there's the bakery restaurant. And Sabrina said, that's where I got lost. And Brittany just let her talk. And then Sabrina said, but the ladies were really nice to me. And Daddy left me. And then she said, but Mommy and Daddy love me. And there's something about that gives us a picture, that's a theological picture, that actually in Daniel 8, there's a lot of lostness. These people when we're in a crisis, when we're in pain, when we're in darkness, we feel utterly lost. I think of our littlest girl, Sabrina, very small, and she sees all these adults, and she has no sign of her dad in that moment. And when we are lost, when we're in a crisis, we don't actually generally feel God there. Often we actually don't see God in our spot. And that can exacerbate the pain. But the story of Daniel, the story of the scriptures, is actually the story of a God who actually never leaves us. He actually said that. I'll never leave you. So the feeling is we've been left. The story in Daniel 8 is that they've been left. The story in the scriptures of humanity is a story that they have been left. And God is saying, no, actually, I've never left you, and I'm going to fix this. I'm going to change this. I'm going to renew this. I'm going to restore this, bring you back. That is a story of in our lostness when we don't experience God. God says, I'm there. I'll restore. I'll heal. The story of Daniel 8 in so many ways is a story of God who can be trusted. a God who can be trusted. He can be trusted. Why? Because actually he reveals history. He gets involved in history. He's not this God who's just going to give us some textbook. And he gets involved in history in Jesus. And he gives us his Spirit to help us. And he also tells us that evil has an expiry date. It ends. It will end. And actually, I'm going to restore the temple. And that tells us of the nature of God, that actually he can restore us. He can restore our lives. He can restore relationships in our lives. He can restore situations that seem irredeemable, because he is that kind of God. Let's pray.